everybody. Welcome to another Mammoth Site Facebook Live. And today we're going to be talking about an animal that you probably have seen at some point in your life, but might not necessarily associate with the Ice Age. And that animal is the bison. So when we say bison or buffalo, here in North America, we use those terms interchangeably. So, for example, we might say the North American buffalo or the North American bison. However, it's pretty important to know that buffalo are actually only found in Africa and Asia. Buffalo or the North American bison probably gets its name from the French word for beef that kind of sounds like a boeuf, and then buffalo. So when we talk about buffalo, most people think of the ones that we have alive today, but they have a history that spans way, way back into the Pleistocene. And so we're going to be looking at a couple of the different species that are found in North America and beyond, and get an idea of what they look like and what they can tell us about the Ice Age. So we've got four species we're going to focus on, and we're going to mention a fifth one at the end. So the first one I like to show people are represented by these two bits of skull here. That's Bison priscus. Now, Bison priscus is important because it's one of the earliest bison we have in North America. We also find it across what we call Beringia, or the Bering Land Bridge, over in Asia and Europe as well. So this guy, we think, is the first bison to migrate over what we call the Bering Land Bridge into North America. Now, if you look at the space between Alaska and Siberia today, there isn't any land connecting it. There's the Bering Strait, and there's a body of water between those. However, during the last ice age, we would have had lots of more glaciers, and those glaciers would have locked up seawater. And as a result, the sea level would have been lower, and we think there would have been land exposed that would have been a nice area for them to cross over. Now, it's important to note that when animals were migrating across this Bering Land Bridge, they probably weren't just immediately going there like they were on a road trip. They were probably just kind of slowly walking through, kind of meandering, basically following the food sources that they can find. Now, Priscus is found up north up north in Alaska and the Yukon, but also further south into what is the United States today. Now, what makes this really cool is since we find them in these northern regions, we sometimes find ones that still have soft tissue preserved, and that soft tissue is really important because it gives us an idea of what their skin would have looked like, what some of their organs, and it also might preserve a little bit more DNA that we can get an idea of how they relate to modern bison. Now, the next bison I want to show you, we have over on this end over here, and this one is probably one of the neatest ones to think about, especially because it's really big. So this one is called Bison latifrons. Now, Bison latifrons, or the longhorned bison, is a bison that had a horn span of roughly 8 feet or so. Now, this guy was also pretty tall. He was probably about 7 feet tall at the shoulder, and those are probably pretty closely related. For example, when this animal gets once they start growing those longer horns and that bigger skull, they're going to need a way to make sure that stays attached, and they're going to make sure they can move their shoulder or their head. So they're going to have bigger shoulder muscles, and then if they have bigger shoulder muscles and bigger neck muscles, they're going to need bones to attach those muscles to. So basically, it's kind of like a domino effect of their horns start to get bigger, and then all of a sudden the rest of their bones kind of have to get bigger to support that. Now, what's also really cool about Bison latifrons is we don't think this one was necessarily living in large herds like when we think of the modern bison. This guy might have lived a little bit more solitary lifestyle. And so he's a little bit different than the modern bison we think of today, and he's one of the most visually distinct of the bison because he's got those really long horns. Moving a little bit further over here, getting a little bit closer to the present, we've got these skulls over here. Now, these ones are really fun. This is Bison antiquus, or the ancient bison. I'm going to be going through, and as I kind of say some of these names, I'll probably try to give you guys the common name for them, just because you might not have heard the scientific name, so in this case, Bison antiquus, but you might have heard of its more common name, the ancient bison, or the antique bison. So these guys are basically, you picture a modern bison, but make it a bit bigger. So these guys live pretty close in time to the modern bison. Some people think they might have actually been they're really closely related, and that's actually one of the really fun things about studying bison, is when we look at these two animals, we have to try to figure out exactly where does Bison antiquus end and Bison begins, or the modern bison. And so these are ones that we can study and kind of look at, okay, see what's the difference in maybe like their horn shape, what's what we call the postcranial skeleton, or the skeleton behind the skull, to see if there's any differences there, to get an idea of how these bison are different. If you look at bison superficially, they pretty much just look like they're different bison with different sizes. So like the modern bison is the smallest, Bison latifrons being the biggest. But it's important to note that size alone is not necessarily the best way to classify two different kinds of species. For example, if we look at modern animals today, for like dogs, you might see a Chihuahua compared to a Great Dane. Both of those are dogs, but they're vastly different in size. So it's important to understand that there can be size variation within a single species, and it's also important to look at what it truly means to be a species. And so with Bison antiquus and Bison bison, one of the important things is trying to figure out where that kind of differentiation is. Now, what's also cool with Bison antiquus and modern bison is in some spots they find evidence of human interaction with these animals in the form of butchering or hunting. So one example, the Hudson Ming site has bison that have evidence of being hunted by ancient Native Americans long ago. We can also see different sites where we can see different methods of hunting these animals. And that's another interesting thing, is seeing how these animals interacted with humans. The last bison that we're going to focus on today is this one right here. This is the North American bison, or bison bison. This one's my favorite just because its scientific name, bison. Bison is basically just the same name twice. What's also interesting is sometimes scientists will differentiate between wood bison and plains bison. And the plains bison is bison, bison, bison. So it's basically the same name 3 times, which makes it pretty easy to remember. Now, what's really cool about bison bison is some of the earliest fossils of these guys are found from around 12,000 years ago, which is towards the end of the last ice age. And that's one of the reasons these guys are extremely important to study, is because they're an example of one of the ice age megafauna, one of the big animals from the ice age that survived till today. So when we think of the ice age and we think of the word megafauna or giant animals, we might think of things like giant ground sloths or mammoths. But it's important to note that some of them, like the bison, are still around today, and we can study them and get an idea of what kind of traits were useful during the ice age and are still useful today. It's one of the interesting things with bison is we see this variation, and since we're not, and with some of them, we're still studying and we're always trying to advance our understanding and get a better idea of the different, what makes these animals different. We can look and see how this genus, bison, adapted to a bunch of different environments. So we can see them, if you look at this map here, we have a bunch of different localities of fossil bison. So they spread through North America, and they did pretty well for themselves. We still have bison around today. And so we can look and see this animal that's an ice age animal that's also a modern animal and get an idea of how it's changed through time and how it's adapted to the change around it through time. What's also kind of neat about bison is when we look at like their sizes, and we can, as we were mentioning with the species, we can see that change, and we can try to figure out what maybe ecological things were impacting them. So for example, modern bison, especially in the plains ecosystems, so tall grass prairies, we think these guys are what we consider a keystone species, meaning that they're extremely important to the survival of other animals around them. And with that, you can kind of see bison, if we stop seeing bison, we see changes in different areas. So bison are going to impact things like prairie dogs that are living here, that are still found here in the Black Hills today. You might also see them impacting the different kinds of plants that are growing and seeing how those different animals interact. Bison are also, if you've ever seen bison in the wild, you might see little birds falling around them. They impact, and they kind of have an impact on the ecosystem and affect everything around them. And so it's important to study them because we can see how they impact the ecosystem of today and see how they would impact the ecosystem of the Ice Age and the Pleistocene. So the last thing I want to show you guys is what I like to call our bison size wall. So over here, you can kind of see the different sizes of these animals, and you can kind of see that there is some similarity between them. So of course, the one on the far right is going to be Bison latifrons, the longhorn bison. One right next to it is Bison antiquus, the ancient bison. And then we have Bison priscus, the one that I mentioned that's crossed over the Bering Land Bridge. And then we have the modern bison, Bison bison, on the very left. And we can see that although it's technically the smallest bison today, or the smallest bison, the modern bison is still a large animal, and they're still an extremely important part of the American West today. We can see them in national parks through many different states. We can see them in state parks. In some places, you can even buy bison burgers. And so they're an extremely important part of understanding, what the American West is, but also what the American West was. And so it's really kind of cool to see these animals and be able to study their fossil remains and the modern animals themselves. With that, I'm going to quick pause to see if we have any questions. Alrighty, with that, feel free to post any questions on this video as you watch it. If you have any ideas for a future video, let us know. I want to thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.